Hello and welcome to this general election debate for Arizona Proposition 140, focusing on open primaries. This debate is sponsored by Clean Elections, the state's nonpartisan voter education agency. My name is Danielle Lerner.
And I'm Richard Rellis. The way we're sharing this debate is part of a brand new effort to support democracy in Arizona. Thanks to this partnership between the Clean Elections Commission, the Arizona Media Association, and Bitfire Studios, we're working to make sure these 2024 debates are the most accessible in Arizona history. That means this debate will air on a long list of local TV stations, radio stations, and digital platforms, including support from local newspapers.
We have tried to keep the rules pretty simple. Each participant representing a perspective about this proposition will have 2 minutes to make an opening statement and 1 minute for a closing statement. Participants have drawn straws to determine the order. Now, throughout the debate, Richard and I will pose questions to each participant, allow them to answer, and then make sure the other debater has a chance to respond. Whenever a question is directed to a specific participant, only their microphone will be open. At all other times, every microphone will be open.
This debate will focus on Proposition 140, and we want to briefly describe it for those tuning in. On your ballot, Proposition 40 will be titled, quote, proposed by initiative petition relating to elections, end quote, and the official description reads as follows. All primary election candidates for a given office will have the same signature requirements for ballot certification. Eligible voters may vote for candidates regardless of party affiliation. The legislature may prescribe the number of candidates advancing to the general election, prohibits using public monies for political party elections, end quote.
Now, we know these descriptions don't fully explain the proposition, so we want to introduce the participants who will be debating for or against this initiative. We have attorney Brennan Bowen from the law firm of Holtzman Vogel. He will be arguing against the proposition. And Prop 140 chair and former Phoenix Mayor Paul Johnson will be arguing for the proposition. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks.
For opening statements, we would like to ask each of you to explain the measure and why you are for or against it. Mr. Johnson, you have the first opening statement. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Well, first, I'd like to thank Clean Elections for holding this. It's important that we do this. I'd like to thank both Danielle and Richard also for being moderators. I'd also like to thank Brennan. I'm a little upset. You know, there are older people you could have picked. You picked a younger, better looking guy than me, but nonetheless, Brennan, thank you very much for being here. And most importantly, I'd like to thank the people who are watching, the people who are taking part in this. Prop 140 is called the Make Elections Fair Act. Now, why is it called that? Because the existing system is unfair. Today, if you are about 1/3 of all voters are either independent or unaffiliated voters, and they're discriminated against in a wide variety of ways. I'm going to give you one. We'll talk about more. I only have 2 minutes, but the one big one is that if you decide as an unaffiliated candidate or an independent candidate to run for office on a statewide basis, you need 6,000 signatures if you run as a Democrat. You need 6,000 signatures if you run as a Republican. You need almost 40,000 signatures to run as an independent. Now, that's just not fair, but it is intentional. And it's intentionally done by the two parties because they don't want independents to be able to participate. Now, if you want to vote for a Republican or Democrat, our initiative protects that. I believe you ought to have the right to not only vote for a Democrat or Republican, but I also think that if you want to vote for a far right person or far left, that should be your choice. But independent candidates have something to offer as well, as do independent voters. The existing system that we have today, it's failing you, and it's failing you in a wide variety of ways. But mainly, these candidates are elected in these partisan primaries by people who basically hold grievances and very small percentages of the public. They effectively have halted our candidates' ability to find compromise on issues like immigration, education, balancing the federal budget. We're going to talk about today this initiative. This initiative works. We know it works. We have evidence that it works, and it's worked right here in Arizona in all of your city elections where the same thing is held true. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Bowen, you have 2 minutes for your opening statement.
Well, I'd like to echo Mr. Johnson's sentiment that thankful you're tuning in tonight and thankful to the Clean Elections Commission for the opportunity to have this debate. I think that might be where our agreement stops for this evening. I believe the most succinct way to sum up Prop 140 is that it is a cure worse than the disease. I'll start by listing some of the effects of the proposition and then talk about some of the mechanics on how it actually does that. In Arizona specifically, Prop 140 will create a patchwork ballot. It will increase voter confusion. It reduces transparency in how the results of elections are generated. It will consolidate more power in the executive branch, in particular the Secretary of State's office, and will likely narrow the options available to voters at the general election. It does this by changing Arizona's primary election system, its general election system, redistributing the power amongst the branches in a way we have not seen in Arizona history. Specifically, it will implement jungle primaries in the primary election system. It will implement ranked choice voting for the general election system, and then make about a dozen other changes, including some to the funding available for elections and the way that initiatives need to generate revenue in order to pass constitutional muster. It makes these changes and gives self-interested politicians, including the Secretary of State, the ability to determine how many candidates will advance from the primary election to the general election, including for their own offices. This is legislative power that the secretaries never had in Arizona's history, and it's not one that's easily changed. If either the legislature or the secretary sets a number of candidates that get to advance from the primary to the general, that number cannot be changed for 6 years. This is flouting a bedrock principle of constitutional law, which is that legislative bodies are not bound by their previous legislative bodies. They're sovereign, and they can make new laws because the people voted them in to do just that. But Prop 140 does away with that, at least in some regards. In short, Prop 140 is a massive restructuring of Arizona's elections and systems of government that will make elections more confusing, more costly, harder to administrate, create longer wait lines for voting and in receiving results, and will be difficult to change if people are unsatisfied with it.
That is your time, and thank you. And we will spend some time, if you two have an hour or so, to go through how this would work in a cycle. But let's begin sort of with some general overview. Mr. Johnson talked about the domination of the current system by two parties. Why is that domination currently a good idea?
I don't know that domination by the parties is necessarily a good idea. I just don't think Prop 140 is the means of fixing it. If, for instance, you wanted to give independents a larger vote, there are much simpler ways to do that. You can make it easier for independent candidates to qualify for the ballot. There's no need to implement something like ranked choice voting, which might, in fact, ensure that independents never get to the ballot. It's part of the reason the Arizona Libertarian Party recently came out in opposition to Prop 140. For example, let's say that you have 3 candidates who are advancing from the primary in the gubernatorial race to the general. Let's say that you take the top 3 vote getters from the primary, and it happens to be 2 Republicans and a Democrat. Independents have no more say. Or if it happens to be 2 independents and a Republican, then Democrats won't have anybody to vote for from their party for the general election. So I don't know that it's giving voters any greater opportunity.
Now, Mr. Johnson, you talked about the importance of independent voters and candidates having a place at the table. Currently, independent voters are able to take part in primaries by asking for a ballot. Most don't. So does this mean that the hurdle to the ballot is too high? Does it mean that independent voters don't want to participate in the primary? How do you interpret that?
So I want to first respond to this issue of what our initiative is. Look, I've been involved in 14 initiatives, and the job of the opposition is always to confuse you, because if you're confused, you vote no. But let me tell you what this isn't. It's not ranked choice voting. That's just not true. Right? We do not do ranked choice voting. It also is not a jungle primary. It's not the California primary. Those are the things that they tell you to confuse you. Our initiative does 3 simple things. The first one, it ensures that all independent voters and independent candidates are treated equally. The second thing that it does, it says that if you're going to hold the primary and you're going to exclude independents from taking part, as they do in the presidential primaries, you can't use their taxpayers' dollars to pay for it. And the third thing that it does is it creates an open primary where all candidates run in the primary system, and they run against one another, and the voters have the right to choose amongst any of them. It gives them the ability to vote for a Democrat, Republican, independent, or unaffiliated voter. In terms of the hurdles, there are many hurdles that are in the way of independence. Start with, if you're an independent voter, if you're a Republican or Democrat, you are on the automatic revoting list. They send you out a ballot. They say, okay, you're included automatically. If you're an independent, you have to request it. If you're an independent candidate, you have to collect more signatures. If you're an independent candidate, you're last on the ballot. Right? There's a reason that there are no independents because the existing system is geared against them intentionally. And it's because the two parties want to hang on to power. Now, my own view is this. I think that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party both offer a great benefit to society, but they shouldn't have the exclusive on our elections. They shouldn't be the ones that get to hold the primaries as they do today.
And Mr. Bowen, if this passed and independent voters automatically were injected into that primary system, how do you think that would skew the results?
Oh, well, it depends on how many people qualify for the ballot in the independent party. But I'd also like to briefly respond to what Mr. Johnson said, that the goal here is confusion. I respectfully disagree. I'd love to elucidate the matter. You can call jungle primaries or open primaries by whatever name, but the effect is this. It will open up primary elections to where, regardless of party affiliation, you appear on the primary ballot. And regardless of party affiliation, you are voting for everyone on that ballot. So Republicans aren't voting strictly for Republicans. Democrats aren't voting strictly for Democrats. Independents don't get to just pick to participate in one or the other. Everyone of every affiliation is voting for candidates of every affiliation. You can call that an open primary. You can call that a jungle primary. The point remains the same, that this is a dramatic change in Arizona's election law. And the contention that ranked choice voting is not included in this initiative is just flatly false. In Section 4 and 6 of the initiative...
we are going to walk through the process.
Well, then I won't jump the gun here, but yes.
And I guess let's walk through the process, what a cycle would look like under this system. We talk about all the candidates needing to get the same number of signatures. What number of signatures, how would that be determined?
So the legislature would determine the amount of signatures, but they couldn't discriminate between an independent or an unaffiliated voter versus a Democrat or Republican. Whatever number they picked would have to be the same. They couldn't discriminate against an independent or an unaffiliated voter. All voters have to be treated equally. The process is pretty simple. In fact, almost everyone that we've spoken to, Secretary of States, recorders, all say this is easier. By the way, it's not new. We do this in every city in Arizona. I've run in both. I understand both systems. I can tell you, the open primary system is a lot better. But most importantly, not discriminating against those people who have differing ideas, who are independents or unaffiliated, who now make up the majority of voters. It's just not fair.
And just to get granular, do you think the percentage would be based on, as it is now, number of registered voters, a percentage would just be picked by the lawmakers?
Yeah, so just making my guess, I know incumbents, there are two things incumbents want. They don't want to have to go do a lot of work, like collecting a lot of signatures. So if they set their number low, they're going to have to set everybody else's low. If they set theirs high, they have to set everyone else's high. Here's the second thing they want. No opposition, which is what the partisan primaries give you. So let me do a little math for you so you can think about this. Today, about 80% of the voters are registered to vote. Of that 80%, about a third are Democrat, a third are Republican, a third are independent. You can argue about 1 or 2 points, but that's about what it is. So if you have a Republican primary, go ahead and times that 70, 80% by the 33%, you get down to about 25%. However, the turnout in those elections is literally only about 25 to 35% of the voters. You're talking about 8% of the people who will vote in one of those primaries. And here's where it gets hideous. It gets hideous in that out of 5,000 seats in America today, 70% are decided in the primary, meaning they never have an opposition. They never have to go talk to people in the other party. They never have to knock on a Democrat or an independent's door if they're a Republican, or the reverse if they're a Democrat.
So let's return back to kind of the current process. Mr. Bowen, why is the current higher signature requirement for independent candidates a better option?
Again, I don't know that that's a better option. I just think Prop 140 is a worse option. It's a cure worse than the disease, as I said earlier. If you're wanting to allow independents a more equal access to the ballot, you could, say, have independents get ballots automatically sent to them the same way that they're automatically sent to Republican and Democrat voters who are registered for the active early voter list. We could do that for independents. We could change the signature requirements so that they were uniform across the board. We could open up a more party-style system for an independent party, allowing for a third party. I'm not opposed to competition and talking with people across the aisle and that people actively participating. But Prop 140 goes way beyond that in a number of areas.
And I just want to say something on that. It doesn't go way beyond what I've said, all right? But number two, and this is important, yeah, they could do it, and they never will. They never will. And they won't because the parties want to maintain control of the existing system. It's a duopoly. And that duopoly has no desire to allow independents or unaffiliated voters or candidates participate.
And again, we're trying to go step by step through the process. With the signature requirements, do you expect, if this goes through, the number of candidates on a ballot would be, for the primary, would be about the same as we're seeing now?
No, just for a simple fact that the number of candidates that you will be receiving on your primary ballot is now just not going to include only your affiliated party. You're going to have parties with whom you're not affiliated at all. So if you're combining all of those together, you're naturally going to have on your particular ballot far more candidates than you've ever had in the past. Even in a very large, say, Republican primary where you had 10 candidates who were competing. Well, you combine in the Democrats and independents, you're just necessarily going to have more. So I don't know that the signature requirement changes a whole lot. I think it's the combining all of them into one primary ballot that is going to create the larger list, the longer ballot, the longer wait times while voting that ballot, and the more candidates you have to sort through on your ballot to figure out who you want.
So after the primary is held, the initiative outlines a process to determine what the general election ballot looks like. In one scenario, the legislature enacts a law determining how many candidates advance. The initiative does set some minimum and maximum numbers. Explain why this is thrown under the initiative to the legislature, and what do you think will factor into that decision?
The legislature today makes all decisions as it relates to elections with very little control by the people or by the Constitution. Very little control. They have the control over the general election. They have control over the primary election. They have control over how independents are treated. Right? We take two of those things away. We take away from them the right to make a decision about discriminating between voters. We make that very solid. Number two, we take away their right to make the decision in a primary. The primary is simple. It's an open primary. Now, the general election is still up to them. They still get to make the choice as to how that operates. They could choose two people to advance forward, or they could choose 3, 4, or 5. The reason that we said that you would use ranked choice voting, if you pick 3, 4, or 5, it's not required, but if they picked it, is because we want to make certain that a majority elect someone and that they're not being elected by 20%. But the legislature will still make the general election or the runoff election decision. Today they have control over all three. Our initiative is simple. We only take two parts away from them.
Mr. Bowen, how do you see this playing out? How would lawmakers make this decision if it was thrown to them?
Well, predicting the legislature's actions, I think, is a fool's errand. But let's say that the legislature is deadlocked or split between Republicans and Democrats in the House or Senate or whatever variation may be. The decision then gets kicked to the Secretary of State. And that's something we're not talking about, is the redistribution of the separation of powers in Arizona. The Secretary will now have the ability to do what the legislature does, legislate. He can choose the number of candidates that advance from the primary to the general. And once that number is determined, the legislature is bound by that for 6 years. So it's not giving any more authority to the people. If the people put in an entire new legislative body on the premise that you are going to go reduce this because we don't like having 5 candidates advance to the general and then implementing ranked choice voting after that, there's nothing they can do for 6 years. They are stuck.
Mr. Johnson, I'd like to go back to something you touched on just a few moments ago, where you talked about how the current system really promotes those two parties dominating. One criticism of Prop 140 is that it could essentially create single-party ballots. How do you respond to that concern?
No, it's poppycock. It doesn't create one-party ballots. Every single candidate runs in the primary. The primary starts to become the more important election because that's where you have the most amount of choices. Again, city elections. They happen all the time. And in city elections, here's what I can tell you. In Democratic districts, Democrats usually win. Republican districts, Republicans usually win. But I do want you to think about the effect that this has on a candidate. So think about the following. When I first ran for city council, I ran in a 2-to-1 Republican district. I was 23 years old. I didn't know any better. But I got a list of everybody that was in that district, Republicans, Democrats, Independents. I knocked on 80,000 doors. I sent out 23,000 postcards to people that I spoke to. Now, when you speak to Republicans, Democrats, they tell you about their local park or their neighborhood school. But when you talk to Republicans, they might tell you about their business and how closing a street was harming them or how regulations were harming them. It wasn't hard to see that maybe these two things were actually connected, right? If you run for the legislature in that same district, you're not going to go get every Democrat, Republican, and Independent. You're only going to get the names of the people in your party. And because 70 to 80% of the seats in Arizona are stacked, meaning the person who wins the primary is over, when you get done talking to them, you never even have to talk to people on the other side. That's why we have these divisions. That's why the problem exists that we have today, because they're not trained to talk to other people. They're not incentivized to listen to other people. If we're going to fix the problems that we have in our society, we have to learn to listen to people who don't think like we think. And an open primary definitely assures that happening. Again, I've run in both. It's a huge difference how a candidate starts looking at issues in an open primary versus a closed one.
And real quickly, Mr. Bowen, your response to concerns that Prop 140 would create a single-party ballots or a uniparty?
I'm very concerned. As I started with in the opening, there's a very real possibility where, let's use again the gubernatorial election. You have 3 candidates advancing. You have a massive open primary. Let's say you get the 3 top vote getters are 2 Republicans and an independent. Democrats will have no candidate available to them at the general election. So what it will allow is majoritarian rule by the majority populace of the state at the more broader level. Now, if we're talking about what's happening at the local level, I think something we need to point out is that Prop 140 is actually internally contradictory. They keep talking about taking power away from the parties and giving it to the people. But what Prop 140 silently does, and that hasn't been trumpeted, is it eliminates the requirement for any form of direct primary elections at the city level. So you could, in fact, have, it is true, I'll point to you later, you could, in fact, have the elimination of a primary system, partisan actors and their parties pick who they want and just send that person along to the general. It strikes it from, I believe, Article 7, Section 10 is the requirement for direct primaries, which includes cities, and it strikes cities out of that.
I'd like to
respond to that.
respond to that. First, I want to apologize, Brennan, for interrupting you. That's not what I should be doing. What I will say, though, is this. In terms of what this does, go to our website, Make Elections Fair. Take a look at the initiative yourself. It just doesn't tell cities that they can't run the exact same election that they do now. In fact, quite the opposite. We like what cities are doing. We've had this way over-lawyered. We spent time asking all these very questions. We've been tested in the court system. The answer is that's not what it does. The also answer is it doesn't create a ranked choice voting. It's an open primary.
We're going to get there. Yeah. Again, walking through how a cycle would work. He's pessimistic that the lawmakers would pass a law by November 1, 2025. If that doesn't happen, and I don't know how optimistic you would be that lawmakers would do that, the decision would go to the Secretary of State, and that decision would be in place for 6 years of how many candidates would advance to the general. Was that provision placed there as an incentive for lawmakers to act?
It was placed there because if you want to know who our biggest opposition is, it's incumbents. Look, today they run in these primaries where they have no opposition, and then they get to the general election where the general election doesn't matter. They're able to avoid real competition. This creates competition. So we're sending this to the legislature and saying, okay, you get to decide on the general. What we're concerned about is that they'd play games on that they would play games to put themselves in a position where it wouldn't get done, and then they could say, oh, we just have to go back to what we had in the last cycle.
Okay.
What we said is, hey, if you don't resolve it, you have the chance to. My guess is they're going to do a top 2. I don't know, but that's my guess of what they're going to do. But if they don't resolve it in any means that they want, then it goes to the Secretary of State, and he can get this done so that we can start sending out ballots to people to follow what the people said that they wanted, which would be an open primary.
Let's circle back and touch on ranked choice voting as that continues to pop up here. The proposal says that if there are 3 candidates in the general election vying for a single office, that ranked voting is used. So would this not be in effect if lawmakers or the Secretary of State determine that only the top 2 winners in a primary advance?
That's correct. I don't need to give you any more than that. You've answered the question perfectly.
Okay, and then just again for clarification and further explanation, for offices with 2 or 3 seats open, like the Corporation Commission, the winners are the ones with the most votes, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay, so is this designed then to eliminate plurality? So when a candidate that arguably most voters did not choose ends up winning by 35 or 40% or so?
Our initiative requires that you have to get to 50%. That's our goal. What I know from seeing and being involved in city elections is the last thing that you want is to have 4 candidates running, all of them get 25%, maybe the most extreme one had 26, and he ends up or she ends up winning. The goal is that we know that you have to have a runoff. And when you have a runoff, you want to make certain that you get to the candidate who has a majority. How the legislature determines that that's going to work, that's still up to them. Now, in the future, voters may come back and take that second part over as well. We wanted to keep ours simple so it's easy to understand, so that you wouldn't have the confusion of saying this is a jungle primary or a top two or a ranked choice voting. Ours simply makes certain that you equalize between all candidates and all voters. They're all treated equally. You can't take taxpayers' money for an election that you don't let people participate in, and that you have an open primary. And if you want an experiment, if you say, hey, I'd like to see it work, City of Phoenix, City of Mesa, City of Tempe, City of Glendale, they all do it. And they've been doing it for a long time.
Now, ranked choice voting, cue the ominous music. Is it valid for voters to be able to express their choice this way? Like, I like candidate A, I like candidate B, but I don't like candidate C. What is wrong with the voter being able to express that through the markings on a ballot?
I guess it depends what you mean by valid. If you mean, is that an effective way for the voter to express those intents, then I would say no, it's not. And first, let me just back up a little bit. It is a truism to say that ranked choice voting is only implemented if you have 3 or more candidates running for an office where one person is going to be appointed. By definition, if you only have 2 people running for that office, then you are going to have one versus the other. There's nothing to rank. It's 1 and 2. You cast the vote for the one you want. You don't for the one you don't want. So in effect, this is ranked choice voting across the board. It's not when there's only 2 candidates, but that's because it's impossible to implement ranked choice voting with 2 candidates. Second, whether people will be able to properly express themselves. This is a big problem with ranked choice voting, and this is the fictional majority that's being created. So I'll give you a perfect example. In the Alaska 2022 special congressional election, the candidate who ultimately ended up winning that won with a margin, I don't want to get this wrong here, of I believe 51.5% majority, we're told. The problem is that in reaching that majority, there were about 11,000 ballots that were what's called exhausted or thrown out. That is, the voter, say, has a pool of 5 potential candidates they can rank. They only rank the top 3 because they think the last 2 just aren't worth their salt. Well, in each successive round, when the least high vote getter is eliminated, it could happen that all the candidates they vote for, A, B, and C, who's I voted for, they're gone. All that's left is D and E. And they have to decide, do I want to vote for these people, do I not? They choose not to rank them, not to mark them. Well, when it's time to count the next round, and we're only down to D and E, your ballot's no good. There's nothing to count for you. So it's thrown out. It's not expressing the will of the people, and it creates a fictitious majority. So turning to that Alaska 2022 special election, that 51.5%, if you were to have included the 11,000 ballots that were thrown out, is actually a 48.4% plurality. These are fictitious majorities being reached as votes are thrown out.
One more on ranked choice voting, and then we'll move on to another issue. But Mr. Johnson, can you break down how would tabulation of ranked choice voting work? And would we expect longer delays, or is there a timeliness element involved in that?
Yeah, so first let me tell you this. This isn't a ranked choice voting effort. There's no reason for me to try to explain that. He keeps saying that it is. Read the initiative yourself. Go online. Take a look at it. It's not a ranked choice voting effort. If you want to oppose ranked choice voting, go to the legislature and tell them you don't want it, because we don't make that determination. The second thing that I would tell you is ranked choice voting is working fine in a lot of different places. I don't have a problem with ranked choice voting. It's just not what our initiative does. In the end, outcomes matter. So I had on my podcast, The Optimistic American, I had the Speaker of the Senate in Alaska come on, where they have ranked choice voting. They have an open primary, but they also have ranked choice voting on the back end. She had opposed both of those when it had gone forward, but she's become since it's been implemented, a supporter. I said, hey, explain this to me. Why were you opposed to it before and now you're supportive of it? She said, well, 2 things. First, she said, in almost every district that was Democrat, the Democrats won. Almost every district that was a Republican still won. She says it didn't have any effect on a Republican Alaska. She says, but I'll tell you what the difference was. She said, under the old system, these were the top 3 issues. Number 1, whether the last election was fraudulent. The second issue was abortion. The third issue was who uses what bathrooms. And both parties were fighting over those. She said, since the new systems come into place, these are the top 3 issues: economic development, education, and transportation. You change the outcomes, and that's why we do this. That's why we look at it, because the existing system is failing you miserably. It's not getting the job done. Most Americans know that. You are choosing between two systems. We know the old system's failing. We're giving one here to try. It's not ranked choice voting. It's an open primary. By the way, you get to 80% of the problem by fixing the primary.
Well, at a time right now when Arizona elections have come under so much scrutiny, you briefly touched on that there for a moment, both in 2020 and 2022. Mr. Bowen, I'll start with you. Is this the right time to try and change the system?
I don't know when the right time to change the system is because I don't have a crystal ball. I can tell you it's not the right time for ranked choice voting because never is the right time for ranked choice voting. And much as my colleague on the other side of the aisle here might insist that this does not involve ranked choice voting, I will echo his sentiment. Go read the initiative. In Prop 140, if you go to Section 4, it removes the prohibition on ranked choice voting. And if you go to Section 6C, it requires ranked choice voting for 3+ candidate races for a single office. So again, if there's ever more than 2, you are going to have ranked choice voting. It might not have been the intent of the drafters, but that's what the language says, and if it gets passed, that's what it will do. As far as outcomes matter, I agree. The outcome of this legislation, it will be that ranked choice voting will be implemented in Arizona anytime there's more than 2 candidates, which is to say anytime it can possibly be implemented.
And do you think, again, voters' confusion, we're dealing with issues of election integrity and people not trusting the system, is this the right time to change it?
Their job's to confuse you, right? Yeah, if you have 3 people, meaning if the legislature says we're going to send the top 3 forward, you would have ranked choice voting. But they send the top 2 forward, you don't. It's that simple. So effectively, what happens in this is we're not dealing with the back end, but it does not require, nor is it, a ranked choice voting effort. And every lawyer I know that's worth his salt that's read this has said that. I mean, literally everyone. That's not to disparage him, but literally, even lawyers on his side have said that. So here's what I come back to. Is it the right time? I don't know. You think it's working the way that it's working today? Do you think that you're getting the results out of your elected officials that you want? Do you like the rancor, the division? Do you like the fact that these guys can't get along and find a way to cross the aisle and get things done? If you like those, there's actually a proposition on the ballot for you. It's called 133. It says let's put into the Constitution and let's leave the primaries as partisan primaries. But if you think we can do better, this offers you that opportunity.
You gave us a lovely transition.
That was the perfect segue to discuss that other proposal that deals with primaries on the ballot, Proposition 133. Let's walk through that just a bit. Mr. Bowen, starting with you, since you are against Prop 140, does that mean you are for Prop 133?
Don't really know that I'm for or against Prop 133 either way, but as a lawyer who's just learning that he's not worth his salt, I will say that Prop 133 essentially just enshrines what already exists, and that is that if you are a Democrat or Republican and you go through the nomination process that is currently enshrined in statute, you will in fact qualify for the general. I think the more interesting question is what happens if both of these pass. There is going to be quite a bit of overlap that is going to be difficult to work out and almost necessitate the courts, and so hopefully lawyers like me who I think are worth their salt can help settle that issue.
What do you think would happen if both pass?
I know what happens. He says he's in election law. And I do think you're worth your salt. I think you're doing a very good job of confusing people. And that's what your job is to do here today. I know what the results are. The one with the highest votes is the one that goes into place. It's not complex. Now, if one loses, it's simple. But if both pass, it's the one with the most votes that is put into place.
And again, just clarifying for folks at home, is a yes for one of these propositions essentially a no for the other?
No, not necessarily. You could vote yes on both. I don't encourage it. I encourage you to pick between the two because they are two very different things, right? You could, if you like the existing partisan system, that's what 133 is. And by the way, I have some very good friends who love the partisan system the way that it works, people who are deeply partisan. For the most part, they're people who hate the people on the other side. They think they're evil. I'm an independent. My own personal view is I think both of them have value. I think both of them bring us something. If you believe that both of them have value, as do independents and unaffiliated, 140 is your choice.
He brought up the idea that cities have used this. You say that there's something in the proposition that might change that.
Yes.
Tell us about what your view is of the cities that have used a system that mirrors this, all candidates in one primary. What is wrong with that? Before you get to how this might invalidate that, What is wrong with that being applied statewide?
Well, I'm a bigger fan of local control, right? So there are things that I don't want the federal government to do that I'm okay with my state doing, and there's things that I don't want the state to implement statewide that I'm okay with the city doing, and the same thing with towns. As we get successively smaller, there's a lot of things that I'll let my 3-year-old daughter do. She can come and borrow money from dad and go out and get some candy. The federal government can't do that to me, right? So as we get successively smaller, I'm okay with cities deciding to implement things how they like. But I will point out again, lest I be accused once more of adding confusion, if you go to Section 5 of the proposition, the bullet point 10 are labeled direct primary elections. In the first sentence, it strikes out the word "and city." This is the requirement that cities hold direct primary elections. This removes that, therefore removing the accountability that the proponents say they're creating for people to the politicians directly instead of having to go through the parties. It is eliminating that at the city level.
Mr. Johnson, let's move forward here. Prop 140 has gone through some legal challenges. What is the current status of that? And just to clear up confusion, can you tell us, will the votes for this count?
Yes. In every initiative I've been involved with, there are 3 or 4 lawsuits that are always filed. The single subject rule is always one of those. We've won the single subject rule. Whether or not you have enough signatures is a second lawsuit that is usually filed. The lower court judge has found in our favor. The bottom line to what he found was that today, what they do is they send out a sample to the county, and the county goes through that sample, and they figure out how many signatures are duplicates and how many are in error. Then they apply that to the entire sample and take them off. The lower court judge said that it would be unconstitutional to then add in the duplicates again and take them off, because it effectively would be raising the amount of signatures that initiatives have to get to be placed on the ballot. And the second issue that he decided on was that it was beyond the time frame. This lawsuit was filed late in the process. It still has to, the Supreme Court still could decide against the lower court judge, but his findings of fact, I think is going to make it very difficult for them to do so.
And Mr. Bowen, why were there so many court challenges to this? Is this simply a way to keep this off the ballot, or were there valid concerns of the way this went through the process?
Well, being one of the people responsible for one of those court challenges, I'll say I think there was valid concerns. I'll start off with one of the 3 areas that are mentioned that are typically challenged. Single subject, that is correct, but that's not what was brought here. It was a separate amendment challenge. We have a constitutional provision in Arizona. When you want to amend the Constitution, you have to amend only one amendment at a time. You can't throw together a bunch of separate amendments and then force people to vote on that in a log rolling sort of fashion. We prefer them to be separate. So it did survive that challenge. It is still currently facing the signature challenge. I believe by the end of this week, early next week, that briefing will be completed at the Arizona Supreme Court, and they are going to have to decide whether the trial court was correct or not. I will notice it's been a little bit of a complicated interplay back and forth. I think this has gone up and down several times from the trial court. Initially not considering evidence it was supposed to. The Supreme Court said, consider this and please resolve it. The trial court then went past the ballot printing deadline, which has traditionally been the deadline to resolve these issues. So it wasn't delay in the parties filing the suit. It was delay in the trial court making its decision. The trial court's got a heavy lift here. There's a lot of signatures to go through. And it was a tough ask, to which the Supreme Court came up with a solution and said, that's okay. If we don't get it done by the ballot printing deadline, we'll put it on the ballot. But if it's ultimately found to not have enough valid signatures to satisfy the Arizona Constitution, then we will just not count those. It's as if it shouldn't have been on there, and we're just not going to count them. So remains to be seen whether votes cast for this will be counted or not. I imagine the Supreme Court will probably weigh in within the next week or 2.
Let's broaden things back out and talk about the increase in independent voters here in Arizona. Mr. Johnson, why do you think there are so many people who don't identify with a party? What explains that? What's happening?
I think what is happening is, for a long time, there's been discussion about a realignment that was going to happen in Arizona politics, meaning theoretically that Democrats, because Hispanics would grow in population, Democrats would increase their numbers. Well, the problem with that was Hispanics began to register as independents, not as Democrats, overwhelmingly. In fact, one of the largest registered groups ends up being Hispanic voters that are independent. But there's not a realignment going on in our country, there's a disalignment. The disalignment is happening because the parties want you to believe that everything is binary. Everything is binary. So either you have to be pro-business or you have to be pro-labor. You can be pro-education or you can be pro-business. You can be pro-God or you can be pro-human rights. It's a binary choice, the way that the parties see it. Well, here's what I would tell you after having run in an open primary. The first question is, how could you possibly be pro-labor without being pro-business? How can you be pro-business without being pro-education? And God doesn't support human rights? I'm not buying it. There are other answers. There are answers where we can find common ground on these things. And I think there are a lot of independents and unaffiliated voters who are just tired of the rancor and the inability to solve our problems. They like America. They like Arizona. They believe that this is a good place. I genuinely believe we live in one of the greatest countries ever in the history of mankind. We've done more to promote human progress than any other country ever. But our democracy is in trouble. Right? We have people who are beginning to lose faith in it. If we don't work on that, it is a significant challenge to the United States and then all that we've meant in the past.
Let's talk about specific messages to different types of voters. Democrats in Arizona they hold the governor's office, they hold the attorney general's office. They've seen some gains against the Make America Great, Donald Trump aligned Republican Party. Why would a Democrat support this measure?
I don't think anyone should support this measure. I will note that there has been bipartisan, maybe even call it tripartisan opposition. As I noted earlier, the Arizona Libertarian Party came out in opposition to Prop 140. There are right-leaning groups such as the Arizona Free Enterprise Club who have come out in opposition to this. There are left-leaning groups such as the League of Women Voters who have come out in opposition to this. So I don't think it's a unifying thing across the spectrum that Republicans are for this or Democrats are for this and the opposite party is against this. There seems to be a groundswell of opposition to this regardless of party affiliation. And I think the ultimate question is it effective? And I don't think that it is. The problems that my colleague has identified, I agree, there are problems. Far too polarized, far too divided. I just don't think this does anything to fix it.
What would you say, Mr. Johnson, to a Democrat who thinks, I'm okay going up against the parties that the Republicans have gone
Brennan
up
picked
against?
out something certainly right. We've done a great job of unifying people on the far right and the far left. They want to leave it like it is. But that wasn't a surprise to us. We understood that. Look, the parties like the way that it works. They like the rancor. They like the fact that they're making that less than 8 to 10% of the public's actually making the decision about who's going to represent you. Of course they're opposed to it. It takes that control that they have today and it disperses it over a larger group of people. From my standpoint, that's a good thing.
Let's talk about independents again for a moment. A mechanism already exists that allows them to vote in those party primaries. So would an education campaign be more effective than enshrining something in the Constitution?
No, the system has been structurally designed to keep them out. You can educate them, but then they have to make certain that they fill out the file and send it back. And you have to make certain that they register in the party that they want to be in. And then you have to make certain that you go to the legislature and get them to change the signature count. And I can tell you for positive, because I've been working on this now for 20 years, they'll never do it. They've done it intentionally. They want to discriminate against those voters. Those are the people who want us to reach across the aisle. And the people that they get elected by, they're driven by grievances as opposed to aspirations. They're mad. They hate the other side. And the last thing they want to do is elect a system that's going to create competition for them. So if your question is, could we just educate them better? No, it's not going to work. You have to create a structure that allows them to participate, just like Democrats and Republicans have.
Mr. Bowen, the publicity pamphlet on the initiative has letters of support from current and former mayors, state lawmakers, at least one governor, Governor Symington, former House Speaker Rusty Bowers, Senator DeConcini. Why are they wrong about this?
They're wrong about this, I think, maybe despite best intentions on focusing on the wrong things. As I said, we brought a challenge to this on separate amendment grounds because we've identified at least 12 to 15 different changes to Arizona's election system and system of governance. If this were just an open primary discussion, that would be great. But it's open primaries, ranked choice voting. It's changing the revenue source rule, which requires you to actually have funding if you're going to pass something that requires funding. It changes the way candidates are funded for by the Clean Elections Commissions for Democrat or Republican primaries. It does a number of things, and again, it is a cure worse than the disease. And ranked choice voting in particular, to the extent the goal here is to enfranchise people and get more people involved, ranked choice voting is a recipe for disenfranchisement. For example, in the New York City mayoral race in 2021, there was about 8 rounds of ranked choice voting because of the number of candidates that were on the ballot. It took 2 weeks to get the results. And by the time they did, the issue that I mentioned earlier about exhausted ballots, people who just got exhausted voting and did not rank everybody, or maybe they just only liked the top 4 and didn't want to number any of the bottom 4 because they didn't want them. The number of people who were exhausted and had their votes not counted because the people they tallied were eliminated after the first 4 rounds was 140,000 ballots. So I don't think this is an enfranchising provision. I think it is disenfranchising.
I'd just say that if Mr. Brennan dislikes the dislikes the ranked choice voting, he should be happy about the fact that the overwhelming majority of legal scholars say this isn't that thing. Now, I know that that's his opinion. It's his legal opinion that it is. But it's not most people who read this. And in fact, it wasn't the intent of the people who put it together. It also wasn't the intent of the lawyers who helped us design it. This has been very carefully crafted to make certain our message is simple. Here's what the voters should pick on. Do you want an open primary or not? Now, what you'll notice is that he doesn't want to spend much time defending the existing system. He doesn't want to spend much time talking about the system that he wants to leave in place if this system goes away. And I'll tell you why. It's not defensible. It's failing us. It's not giving us what we need to create a better state and a better country.
I mentioned the publicity pamphlet had a bunch of current and former office holders holding it. I guess another way of looking at it is you have a lot of support from people who the system has served well, and maybe it benefits politicians who would give small incremental change rather than looking to upend the way things are done. Does this keep politics too moderate, too incremental?
Does it make it too moderate? No, but it also doesn't guarantee you that the decisions that are being made are all moderate decisions. That's not the goal here. The goal here is to include more people. If we're going to solve the problems that we have in our society, a couple of things are key. Here's the first one. We need the free marketplace of ideas. We need more people being able to feed ideas into the system. Here's the second thing that we need. We need people who are willing to cross the aisle and work with people that they disagree with. And then here's something that we all need to do. We have to be willing to listen to people that maybe we disagree with. We have to be willing to understand that they too are Americans. They too are citizens. What this does is it ensures a broader breadth of people who are listening to people outside those two political norms, those two partisan norms of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, or at least the narrow group of people who vote in those primaries.
And speaking of those parties, Mr. Bowen, in your opinion, what purposes have political parties served?
I think they provide a mechanism for people to choose the issues they want very specifically and that they most ideologically align with. Now, the political parties have existed for a long, long time. And I agree that today things are very polarized. It seems to be that, the parties have zero overlap on issues that they agree with. But that wasn't always the case. I mean, you can rewind the clock not that long ago and you could find pro-life Democrats. Hard to find these days. You could find, pro-union Republicans. Up until recently, that was not something you were going to find. It's shifting. So I think that there are cultural issues at play here, and we are attempting to legislate some cultural things that maybe we cannot change through legislation. That the party system has existed for a long time and has served varying interests. And yes, the parties shift and they change over time. But I think that shows that they're responsive to the people they serve, not that they're ignoring them. And that they are, in fact, very divided political parties, I think is the result of a culture that's very divided. I think we got the tail wagging the dog here. I don't think politics got divided and then people got divided. I think people got divided and then politics got divided.
Decades ago, one of the last major election reforms in Arizona was the clean election system. Mm-hmm. One of the sponsors of today. That was supposed to get money out of politics and get new people engaging with new ideas for voters. Some political analysts have said that the years since, I mean, that money was a way of vetting potential candidates, and that now that system has sort of produced the situation we have now. That gatekeeping option that parties had is gone. What would you say to a voter who's wary of enshrining this novel idea into the state constitution where, because of another voter-approved initiative, it would be very difficult to change?
What I would say to them is, it is your choice, right? You have a choice of voting for this measure or against this measure, or for 133 or against it. What I would encourage them to do is take a look at the existing system and ask if it's delivering the results that you think that it should be delivering. Take a look at your city council versus your legislature. There are a lot of people who look at the legislature and they say, no, I like the partisan system. My guess is you'd vote for Prop 133 if that's what you like. But most people, well, the polling's obvious on this. Here's an interesting polling statistic. About 19% of the public likes our legislature. About 19 to 20% likes Congress, sometimes down as low as 16. Cities in Arizona, with the exception of one, have a popularity number that's in the high 50s, right? Around the country, that's true, except in cities that are partisan cities, and they fall right back down to 19. You can make government work. You can make it more responsive to the public, but not if you cut out a third of the voters. Those voters that you're talking about, today around the country, Gallup has listened to people, and they say that it's close to 50% of the public who identify with being independent. They're moving away from the parties, and the parties used to have all of the public inside of them. Now they're trying to maintain that control by cutting those people out who are independent and unaffiliated, and that's just not fair.
Do you think the parties, a version of the question we asked him, do you think parties have a valid role to play? Did they have a different role to play that has now changed?
Yes, I do. Let me start with this. First, I'm going to give you my philosophy because that's what this is. This isn't our initiative or the people that are on the committee, but you asked a question, so I'll answer it. I think that in our country's done a lot of great things. We've built dams and bridges. We've taken people to the moon. But the single greatest thing that our government ever did, is it empowered the individual over itself. Now, by doing that, we've created unbelievable things. The parties in the past had been helpful in that. Democratic Party, I think, has done a fairly good job of focusing on education and things that people oftentimes care about. But the Republican Party, at least until lately, had done a better job on business. My own personal opinion is those are symbiotic. They're connected. You want both of them to work. So I'm not looking to kick the Republicans and Democrats out. In fact, I think if they have to go compete for independence, they're going to become stronger as opposed to weaker. They become weaker because they're only trying to appeal to their extreme groups. But do I think they're important? I love my friends on both sides, and I have very Republican friends and very Democratic friends. I do think they provide a value.
Mr. Bowen, very briefly on two matters. Do you think the parties are doing their job? And secondly, what would you say to a voter who's wary about enshrining something in the Constitution?
I would say, I'd start with the second question first. I think the voter would be rightly wary to be concerned about what's being enshrined in the Constitution here. And I'd like to just take a step back and point out, this is being presented, ironically, while contesting that binaries are a terrible, awful thing as a binary. Either you love the awesome, perfect system that exists now, or it's terrible and awful and you need to change it via Prop 140. There is a third option, which is the system's not working now and Prop 140 is not the answer, which is what I'm here to say. And in particular, much as we might decry the intent of the drafters and the lawyers who constructed this, and I believe they had the best intents at heart, I don't impugn their intent in the least bit, for the purposes of the court, and I learned this when I clerked at the Arizona Supreme Court, the best way to gauge intent is what is drafted, and what is drafted is ranked choice voting.
All right, well, it is already time for closing statements. So each of you has 1 minute, and of course, we're tight on time, so we're going to stick to that 1 minute. Mr. Johnson, you have the first closing statement.
Well, first, again, I'd like to thank Clean Elections, both of you, and Brennan, I'd like to thank you as well. Look, I've been all around the state, for that matter, I've been all around the country, and there are definitely people who are beginning to lose hope. They're losing faith that democracy can fix these problems that we have. In many cases, or in some cases, some people are actually looking at trying to abandon democratic values. Here's what I would tell you. It does work. We've created something special and unique in the United States. I am a huge supporter of our system, and I actually am a supporter of both parties. But By including independents, by including unaffiliated voters, we won't make them weaker. We'll make them stronger because they'll have to compete for them. And most importantly, what all of us have to do is we can't give up hope. We have to have faith that we can, in fact, fix things. Today, many people are losing that. I'm here quite simply because I still believe.
All right, Mr. Bowen, you have 1 minute.
Thank you. And I'd like to echo what Paul said. Thank him for being here. And I'm here because I still believe. I just believe that Prop 140 is not the answer that has been portrayed. If the concern is transparency and trust in elections, implementing a system that is going to require algorithms and computers to calculate ranked choice voting is not going to help people trust the system. If the concern is about separation of powers, taking legislative power and giving it to the secretary and then binding the hands of future legislatures to change the ranked choice voting system is not going to achieve that. If the concern is about the lack of accountability from the politicians to the voters, then eliminating city direct primaries is not going to do that. It is a cure worse than the disease. The problems facing us are real, and we do need comprehensive answers to them. Prop 140 is not that answer.
Well, thank you both for being here today. That is all the time we have for today's debate over Arizona Proposition 140. On behalf of our partners at Clean Elections, the Arizona Media Association, Reister, and Bitfire Studios, thanks for joining us.